It was a calm, sunny morning, and Rachel Collins had just finished her errands at the local farmer's market. As she walked back to her car, she waved at a few familiar faces and exchanged pleasantries. Rachel was well liked in the community, not because of her husband's position as the city commissioner, but because of her warm personality and dedication to local causes. She was always the first to volunteer, organizing events, helping neighbors in need, and even sponsoring scholarships for local students. Today, however, was supposed to be a quiet day. She had planned to pick up fresh vegetables, drop by the bookstore, and then head home for a peaceful afternoon. But fate had other plans. As Rachel unlocked her car, she noticed a police cruiser pulling up behind her vehicle. Two officers stepped out, each wearing a stern expression. Initially, she thought nothing of it. Maybe they were patrolling the area. However, the officers approached her directly, with an intensity in their stride that made her stomach twist. "Ma'am, we need you to step out of the vehicle." One of the officers, a tall, burly man with a slight scowl, demanded in a tone that held no warmth. Rachel blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me, is there a problem?" "We have reason to believe this vehicle may be involved in suspicious activity," the officer replied, avoiding her question. "Please step out of the car, Mom." Rachel felt a pang of embarrassment as a few people turned their heads, curious about the unfolding scene. She felt heat rising to her cheeks, but tried to remain calm. "Officer, I think there's been some misunderstanding. I'm Rachel Collins, and I'm not involved in anything." "Identification, please," the officer interrupted, his tone now edging on impatience. She reached for her ID and handed it over, hoping her name would clear up any confusion. "I'm the wife of Commissioner Ethan Collins," she explained calmly, assuming that mentioning her husband's name might help diffuse the situation. But the officers merely glanced at her ID, barely registering her words. "Please step out of the vehicle," the second officer, a younger, more eager-looking man, repeated firmly. "We need to conduct a search." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. A search? But why? "I haven't done anything wrong, and there's nothing in my car that would warrant." "Ma'am, if you do not comply, we will be forced to take additional measures," the younger officer interrupted, his voice cold and rigid. His words hung in the air, an unspoken threat that made her blood run cold. Rachel's mind raced. She had never been in trouble with the law, and the thought of causing a scene was mortifying, especially in such a public place. Yet as she glanced around, she noticed a few people beginning to pull out their phones, recording the interaction. She knew she was being watched, and every fiber of her being screamed to protect her dignity. With a deep breath, Rachel stepped out of the car, hoping to reason with them. "Please," she said, her voice soft but steady. "There must be some mistake. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I don't understand why you need to search my car." The older officer stepped closer, his gaze cold and unyielding. "You've been reported for suspicious activity, ma'am. We don't make mistakes about these things." Rachel felt a pang of disbelief and frustration. Suspicious activity? I was just at the market. This is completely unnecessary. Ignoring her protests, the younger officer moved toward her vehicle, opening the driver's side door and beginning a thorough search. Rachel felt a swell of indignation as she watched him rummage through her personal belongings. Her purse, her grocery bags, even her glove compartment. Every moment felt like an invasion, a violation of her privacy, and she fought to keep her composure. As the search continued, more bystanders gathered, some whispering among themselves, others watching in silence. The tension was thick, the humiliation mounting with every second. Rachel clenched her fists, her mind racing as she grappled with whether to call her husband. Part of her wanted to resolve this quietly, to avoid dragging Ethan into what she hoped was just a misunderstanding. But as she watched the officers treating her belongings as potential evidence, the reality of the situation sank in. This was not going to resolve itself quietly. The younger officer finally turned to her, with a smirk that sent a chill down her spine. "Nothing here," he announced to his partner, almost disappointed. The older officer, however, wasn't ready to let it go. He looked at Rachel with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. "Just because we didn't find anything this time doesn't mean there's not more to uncover, Mrs. Collins. We'll be keeping an eye on you." Rachel was left speechless. The insinuation was clear. They didn't believe her, and they intended to make her life difficult. She took a step back, feeling as though the ground was shifting beneath her. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something darker, a deliberate act meant to shake her, to remind her of her place despite her connections. At that moment, she realized she couldn't simply let this go. She had been humiliated, her privacy violated, and her integrity questioned, all without a shred of evidence or legitimate cause. Swallowing her pride, she pulled out her phone and dialed Ethan's number, her fingers shaking as she pressed the call button. When he answered, she could hear the concern in his voice immediately. "Rachel, is everything okay?" She took a deep breath, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Ethan, I need you to come to the farmer's market. There's been an incident with the police." There was a beat of silence, and then she heard the familiar edge of determination in his tone. "I'm on my way." As she ended the call, she looked back at the officers, who were now trying to disperse the gathering crowd, telling people to put their phones away. But Rachel knew there was no turning back now. This was about more than just her. It was about standing up against an abuse of power, even if it meant facing further consequences. She braced herself, knowing that once Ethan arrived, the situation would likely take a turn she couldn't fully predict. Ethan Collins had always been a man of principle. As the city commissioner, he had built his reputation on transparency, accountability, and fairness, values that he had dedicated his career to upholding, especially within the law enforcement community. He was known for cracking down on corruption and advocating for policies that held officers to high standards of accountability, a stance that had made him a figure both admired and resented. Ethan was no stranger to the pushback that came with his position. He had made enemies over the years, some even within the very department he was trying to reform. Yet, he had always believed that his principles would guide him through any storm. But today was different. This wasn't just about his job or his reputation. This was about his family. As Ethan sped toward the farmer's market, his mind raced, fueled by a mixture of anger and concern. He couldn't shake the image of his wife standing vulnerable in front of a crowd, subjected to a humiliating search with no probable cause. He had seen countless cases of wrongful treatment before, but he never imagined that Rachel, kind, gentle, civic-minded Rachel, would be on the receiving end of such injustice. By the time he pulled into the parking lot, his jaw was clenched, his hands tight on the steering wheel. A small crowd was still lingering near Rachel's car, whispering among themselves, their gazes shifting between Rachel and the two officers who had accosted her. Ethan stepped out of his car and scanned the scene, his eyes landing on Rachel. She looked shaken, visibly upset, but as soon as she saw him, her expression softened slightly, a mixture of relief and apprehension in her eyes. Without a word, he walked up to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning his attention to the officers. He could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, the tension so thick it was almost palpable. The older officer, a gruff man with a stern face, was visibly uncomfortable as he recognized Ethan. The younger officer, still standing beside Rachel's car, looked a bit smug, almost defiant, as if he hadn't quite processed the severity of the situation. Ethan kept his voice calm but firm as he addressed the older officer. "What's going on here? Why was my wife subjected to a search without probable cause?" The older officer shifted uncomfortably but maintained a professional tone. "Commissioner Collins, we received a report of suspicious activity involving this vehicle. We were simply following protocol." Ethan's gaze hardened. And what exactly was the nature of this suspicious activity? "My wife was at the farmer's market, buying groceries. Hardly the scene of a criminal offense." The officer cleared his throat, clearly feeling the pressure of the onlookers and Ethan's unyielding stare. "We were told to be on high alert in this area today. We're doing our job. Ethan's patience was wearing thin. Doing your job doesn't involve publicly humiliating an innocent person. And for the record, if you had any legitimate reason to suspect wrongdoing, you would have conducted this search with some level of respect and professionalism. He paused, his voice dropping a notch. Did you know who she was when you stopped her? The officer looked away, avoiding his gaze. The silence that followed spoke volumes. Rachel reached for Ethan's hand, a silent reminder for him to stay calm. But he could feel the fury bubbling beneath the surface. This was more than just an insult to his wife. It was a calculated attempt to undermine him, to strike at his family in retaliation for the reforms he'd been pushing within the department. He could almost feel the invisible walls around him closing in. Someone somewhere had orchestrated this as a warning, a message that he was being watched, that his fight for justice was stirring up enemies who weren't afraid to play dirty. The younger officer, clearly emboldened, spoke up, his tone almost condescending. Commissioner, we have every right to investigate suspicious behavior, regardless of who it is. Being the wife of a commissioner doesn't put anyone above the law. Ethan felt a surge of anger at the officer's audacity. That's true, officer, he replied evenly. But what you did here had nothing to do with enforcing the law and everything to do with abusing your authority. My wife's rights were violated in broad daylight, with no evidence or reasonable suspicion. That's not law enforcement, that's intimidation. The young officer opened his mouth to respond, but the older officer quickly interrupted, sensing the conversation was about to spiral out of control. Commissioner, if you have an issue with our conduct, you're free to file a formal complaint. But we were acting on orders. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Orders from whom? The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. Those details are confidential, sir. The cryptic response sent a chill down Ethan's spine. It was becoming clear that this wasn't a random act by rogue officers. This was something bigger, something more calculated. Someone had issued those orders, someone with the power to direct these officers to harass Rachel as a message, and that someone had access to enough information to execute it in the most public way possible. Just then, another car pulled up, a black sedan with tinted windows. The door opened, and out stepped Deputy Chief Marcus Voss, a tall, imposing figure who had been a silent opponent of Ethan's policies for years. Voss was known for his loyalty to the old ways, someone who viewed accountability measures as softening the police force. Ethan had often suspected that Voss harbored a deep resentment toward him, but he'd never imagined that the resentment would escalate to a personal attack. Voss strode over, his expression a mixture of feigned concern and satisfaction. Commissioner Collins, I came as soon as I heard. Is everything all right here? Ethan forced himself to remain calm, though he could feel the anger simmering just below the surface. Deputy Chief Voss, perhaps you could explain why two of your officers felt it was necessary to publicly search my wife's vehicle without probable cause. Voss raised his hands in mock innocence. Now, Commissioner, I wasn't aware of the specifics. I was just informed that there was a potential security risk in the area. I'm sure my officers were just being vigilant. Vigilant? Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper, laced with barely contained fury. This was not vigilance. This was harassment. And if you think I'm going to let this go unaddressed, you're mistaken. Voss shrugged, his gaze cold and unflinching. I assure you, Commissioner, no one here intended any disrespect. But I would advise against making this into more than it is. After all, our officers are simply doing their job, keeping the public safe. You of all people should understand that. The underlying threat in Voss's words was unmistakable, a chilling reminder that his influence stretched further than Ethan had anticipated. It was a warning, a signal that Ethan's push for change had gone too far, and that his family would be the price he paid if he continued down this path. Rachel tightened her grip on Ethan's hand, silently pleading with him to let it go, but he couldn't. He had spent years fighting to make the police force more accountable, more just, and this was the response, a brazen display of power designed to make him back down. He knew that if he walked away from this, it would send a message to everyone watching that even he, the commissioner, could be silenced, intimidated, and controlled. But he couldn't simply blow up here, not with so many eyes on him. So, with every ounce of restraint, he looked Voss in the eye and spoke, his voice cold and precise. "This isn't over, Voss. You may have gotten away with this today, but make no mistake, I will get to the bottom of this. And when I do, there will be consequences." Voss's expression didn't waver, but there was a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Of course, Commissioner. We're all looking forward to seeing justice served." The words were laced with sarcasm, a final twist of the knife that made Ethan's blood boil. As Voss turned and walked away, his officers following close behind, Ethan stood there, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger, humiliation, and determination. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but he could feel their gazes lingering, their curiosity and judgment pressing down on him. Rachel's hand slipped from his as she stepped back, her face etched with worry. "Ethan, are you sure this is the right thing to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Maybe we should let it go. For us." But Ethan knew there was no going back. This wasn't just about him or Rachel. It was about standing up against something far darker, an insidious force within the very system he had sworn to protect. As he looked around at the faces of his fellow citizens, he knew that the decision he made today would echo far beyond this moment. Taking a deep breath, he looked at Rachel, a silent promise in his eyes. "I have to do this," he said softly. "Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel powerless." He held her hand as they turned to leave, but he knew the road ahead would be treacherous, filled with challenges that would test his resolve, his values, and his love for Rachel. This was only the beginning, but he was ready. The following morning, the city was buzzing. News of the incident at the farmers' market had spread rapidly. Videos of Rachel's confrontation with the officers were circulating online, sparking outrage and curiosity. People watched in shock as the wife of the city commissioner was humiliated in broad daylight by two officers acting under mysterious orders. Comments poured in from all sides, some supporting Rachel and Ethan, others questioning if this was another case of powerful people expecting special treatment. But for every person who questioned her actions, there were 10 others who stood in solidarity, recognizing this incident as part of a larger, more troubling trend in the city. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, his face set in a mask of controlled anger as he scrolled through his phone. The public reaction was mixed, but it was enough to confirm his suspicions. People were fed up with the misuse of power within the department. His mind was already whirling with thoughts of how to proceed, of who he could trust, and what steps he would need to take to ensure justice for Rachel and accountability within the force. He knew this wasn't just about his wife anymore. This was about the soul of the city, about making sure that no one, regardless of their social status or connections, would ever feel powerless again. Rachel entered the kitchen, her expression weary yet determined. She placed a comforting hand on Ethan's shoulder, and for a moment, they sat in silence, drawing strength from each other. She knew he was preparing for a fight, one that could jeopardize his career, his reputation, even their safety. But she also knew Ethan well enough to realize there was no talking him out of it. He was a man driven by his convictions, and if he didn't act now, he would never forgive himself. "Are you sure about this, Ethan?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of concern and support. This could get ugly. Ethan took a deep breath, squeezing her hand. "I have to do this, Rachel. They crossed a line, and if I let them get away with it, who knows what they'll do next. This isn't just about you. It's about every person who's ever been mistreated, ignored, or silenced." Rachel nodded, understanding. "Then I'm with you, whatever happens." Ethan's first call was to the mayor. Mayor Lynn Carmichael was a longtime friend, someone who had supported his reforms in the past, though her own position was precarious. She was under pressure from various factions within the city, and he knew that involving her directly would place her in a difficult spot, but he also knew he couldn't do this alone. As he dialed her number, he thought back on their many conversations over the years. They had spoken countless times about accountability, about making the city a place where people felt safe and respected. Yet he also knew that her hands were often tied, forced to balance the expectations of different interest groups. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Ethan," she said, her voice laced with concern. "I heard about what happened. Are you and Rachel all right?" "We're holding up," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "But Lynn, I need your help. This isn't just about us. It's about fixing a much bigger problem in the department. The officers who humiliated Rachel acted under orders, and I want to know who gave those orders and why." There was a pause on the other end, and he could sense her hesitation. "Ethan, you know how complicated this is. The department's been resistant to change for years, and there are people there who would do anything to protect their power. If you go after them, you could make some very dangerous enemies. I understand the risks, Lynn. But I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking for support. We can't keep letting these abuses happen just because it's politically inconvenient. This city deserves better." She sighed, and he could hear the weariness in her voice. "All right, Ethan. I'll back you up, but be careful. The people you're dealing with, they don't play fair." As he hung up, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had support from the mayor, which meant he had at least a small amount of leverage. But he knew that wasn't enough. He needed allies within the department, people who were loyal to justice rather than power. He thought of Chief Inspector Daniel Harkness, a seasoned officer with a reputation for integrity. If anyone could help him uncover the truth, it would be Harkness. Ethan set up a meeting with Harkness later that day, choosing the secluded coffee shop on the edge of town to avoid drawing attention. When Harkness arrived, he wore a guarded expression, clearly aware of the risks associated with meeting the commissioner under such circumstances. "Ethan," Harkness greeted him with a nod as he took a seat across from him. "I have to say, I was surprised to get your call." "I wouldn't have reached out if this wasn't important," Ethan replied, leaning forward. "You know what happened to Rachel. This wasn't just a mistake. Those officers were following orders, and I need to know who's behind it." Harkness looked around, as if ensuring they weren't overheard, before he spoke in a low voice. "I've been hearing whispers, Ethan. People high up in the department are getting nervous about your reforms. They think you're trying to change too much, too fast. Some of them are willing to do whatever it takes to make you back down." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And Voss, is he involved?" Harkness nodded slowly. "He's more than involved. He's orchestrating it. Voss has built alliances within the department, especially with the younger officers who see him as a protector of traditional values. He's been quietly undermining your initiatives for months, and this incident with Rachel, it's his way of sending you a message." Ethan clenched his fists under the table. "Then I need proof, Daniel. Something concrete I can use to expose him." Harkness sighed, rubbing his temples. "Getting proof won't be easy. Voss is careful. He doesn't leave a paper trail. But I might have an idea. There's a group of officers. One's Voss considers his inner circle. They meet off the books, in private. If we can find out when and where they're meeting, we might be able to gather the evidence you need." Ethan felt a flicker of hope, tempered by the gravity of what they were up against. "Can you get me that information?" Harkness nodded. "I'll see what I can do. But Ethan, be careful. Voss isn't just playing politics. He's willing to go to any length to protect his power. If he realizes we're onto him, he won't hesitate to retaliate." Ethan met Harkness's gaze, his resolve hardening. "I know the risks, but this has to end. People like Voss have been running this city for too long, and it's time someone held them accountable." As they left the coffee shop, Ethan felt a mixture of hope and dread. He was on the cusp of something monumental, a battle that would test his integrity, his courage, and his loyalty to the city he loved. But he also knew that this fight would come at a cost, that the forces he was up against were willing to do whatever it took to maintain their hold on power. That night, as he sat with Rachel, he explained everything he'd learned. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she listened. "So, it's Voss," she murmured, a mixture of anger and fear in her voice. "I always suspected he didn't like you. But I never thought he'd go this far." Ethan nodded. "He sees me as a threat. And he's not wrong. But I'm not going to let him get away with this. Not after what he did to you." Rachel looked at him, her eyes filled with both admiration and worry. "Just promise me you'll be careful, Ethan. I don't want to lose you to this." He took her hand, his expression softening. "I promise, Rachel. I'll be careful. But I have to see this through. For us, and for everyone in this city who deserves justice." The days that followed were tense, filled with whispered conversations, secret meetings, and a growing sense of anticipation. Harkness eventually provided Ethan with the information he needed, a time and place where Voss and his inner circle would be meeting, away from prying eyes. Ethan knew it was a risk, but he also knew that this was his chance to expose Voss for who he truly was. As he prepared for what lay ahead, he felt a sense of clarity, a renewed sense of purpose. This was the fight he had been preparing for his entire career, the moment where he would finally have the chance to make a real difference. And he knew, deep down, that whatever the outcome, he was ready to face it head-on. The night of the meeting arrived with a chill that seemed to settle over the city like a heavy fog. Ethan sat in his car, a few blocks away from the nondescript warehouse where Harkness had informed him Voss and his inner circle would be gathering. Ethan felt a knot of tension in his stomach as he watched the minutes tick down. The meeting was set to begin in less than 15 minutes, and the surrounding streets were silent, deserted. He glanced at his phone, half expecting a text from Harkness calling the whole thing off, or worse, a warning that their plan had been discovered. But no messages came. The air was thick with an almost surreal stillness, the kind that precedes a storm. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself. He knew what he was risking by being here. If Voss or any of his loyalists discovered him, his career, and possibly his life, could be in danger. But after what Rachel had endured, he couldn't simply walk away. He owed it to her, to his city, and to himself to see this through. He adjusted the small recording device hidden in his jacket pocket, one of the few pieces of evidence he could trust. It would be his lifeline, his proof if he managed to catch Voss in the act. Ethan knew he would need something solid, irrefutable, to bring Voss and his network down. Speculation and accusations wouldn't be enough. He had to capture their words, their plans, their admissions. Ethan slipped out of his car, keeping to the shadows as he made his way down the dimly lit alley that led to the warehouse. The building was dark, save for a few lights in the upper windows, signaling the presence of Voss and his inner circle. Ethan had been here before, back when this building was used as a city storage facility, and he knew there was a small side entrance that led to an old maintenance stairwell. It was his only chance to get close enough to overhear without being seen. As he made his way up the narrow stairs, his heart pounded in his chest. Every creak of the old metal steps felt amplified, echoing in the silence. He stopped outside a door that opened onto a storage loft overlooking the main floor, holding his breath as he listened for any signs of movement below. From his position, he could hear the muffled sound of voices coming from the room beneath him, growing louder as more officers arrived. Hearing through a crack in the door, he could see Voss standing at the head of a table surrounded by several officers, all of them looking at him with a mix of loyalty and anticipation. Voss's voice was calm but filled with authority as he addressed the group. "Gentlemen, I trust you all know why we're here. Commissioner Collins and his so-called reforms have been a thorn in our side for too long. He thinks he can come in and change the way we do things, but we're not about to let that happen. Not without a fight." One of the officers, a younger man with a hardened expression, spoke up. "But what about the incident with his wife? Isn't he going to come after us harder now?" Voss chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "Let him try. We have enough people in the department to make his life miserable if he pushes any further. Collins may be the commissioner, but he's just one man. He's up against an institution, and we have ways of dealing with those who get in our way." Ethan's hand tightened around the recorder in his pocket, his anger simmering as he listened to Voss speak so brazenly about manipulating the very system he'd sworn to uphold. Voss was treating the city like his personal playground, willing to twist laws, bend morals, and sacrifice anyone who dared to stand in his way. And the worst part was, the officers around him seemed unfazed, as if they had all accepted that this was simply the way things were. One officer, whom Ethan recognized as a lieutenant he'd once trusted, spoke up. "And if Collins doesn't back down?" Voss's smile widened, a glint of malice in his eyes. "Then we take more drastic measures. The incident with his wife was just a warning shot, but we can escalate if we need to. I have connections, people willing to make things difficult for him and his family. All it takes is a few well-placed calls, a few more incidents, and he'll be too busy defending himself to worry about us." The lieutenant nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Understood. But what if the mayor gets involved? She's been backing Collins for a while now." Voss shrugged. "Lynn Carmichael is weak. She's too afraid to rock the boat. As long as we keep things under the radar, she'll stay out of it. Besides, she's got her own scandals to worry about. One whisper in the right ear, and she'll be dealing with her own mess instead of meddling in ours." Ethan felt a wave of disgust. This was worse than he had anticipated. Voss wasn't just targeting him. He was ready to weaponize the system against anyone who stood in his way, manipulating public officials, officers, and even innocent civilians to secure his power. And the people around him, officers who had taken an oath to protect and serve, were nodding along, complicit in his plans. He knew he had to get out of there before he was discovered, but his hand remained frozen on the recorder, his heart pounding as he heard Voss continue. "Now let's talk about the next steps," Voss said, his tone growing colder. "The commissioner's wife was just the beginning. If he doesn't fall in line, we have other ways of making him understand his place. We can start with small disruptions, nothing too overt, a few random traffic stops, inspections of his properties, audits of his finances. Make him feel the pressure. And if he still doesn't back down..." Voss's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. One of the officers smirked. "You mean we make an example out of him?" Voss nodded, his eyes hardening. "Precisely. Collins has been a nuisance long enough. If he refuses to cooperate, we'll make it impossible for him to function in this city. And if that means his family suffers, so be it." Ethan's stomach churned. They weren't just targeting him. They were willing to go after Rachel, maybe even other innocent people, to maintain their control. He knew he had heard enough, that this was all the evidence he needed. Slowly, he backed away from the door, his footsteps light on the metal stairs as he made his way back down, his heart pounding in his ears. But just as he reached the bottom of the stairwell, a voice called out from behind him. "Commissioner." He froze, his blood running cold. Turning slowly, he saw one of Voss's men standing at the end of the hallway, his hand on his gun, a suspicious glint in his eye. "Didn't expect to see you here," the officer said, his tone laced with accusation. "What are you doing sneaking around?" Ethan's mind raced, his hand instinctively going to his jacket pocket to make sure the recorder was still secure. He forced himself to remain calm, meeting the officer's gaze steadily. "Just taking a walk, officer. I didn't realize I'd wandered into restricted territory." The officer smirked, clearly not buying the excuse. "Funny, because it looks to me like you were eavesdropping. And I'm sure Deputy Chief Voss would be real interested to know why you're here." Ethan knew he couldn't let this man raise the alarm. If Voss found out that Ethan had been listening, he'd do everything in his power to destroy the evidence and discredit him. Without hesitation, Ethan lunged forward, catching the officer off guard as he knocked the gun from his hand and grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the wall. "Listen to me." Ethan whispered fiercely. "You don't want to be a part of this. Voss is going down, and if you're smart, you'll keep quiet and walk away." The officer's eyes widened, a flash of fear crossing his face. For a brief moment, he hesitated, then gave a small, reluctant nod. Ethan released him, watching as he scrambled to his feet and hurried down the hallway, casting a wary glance over his shoulder. Ethan didn't waste another second. He slipped out of the building, moving quickly through the shadows until he reached his car. His hand shook as he fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. As he drove away, his mind was racing with everything he had just heard, the weight of Voss's words pressing down on him like a stone. He knew what he had to do. He would take this recording to the mayor, to the media if necessary. He would expose Voss and his network, reveal the corruption that had festered within the department for far too long. But he also knew that he had just put a target on his back, that Voss and his allies would do everything in their power to silence him before he could act. But as he drove through the quiet streets, a sense of determination filled him. He wasn't just fighting for himself, or for Rachel. He was fighting for every person in the city who had suffered under Voss's reign, for every voice that had been silenced, every life that had been disrupted. And he knew, deep down, that whatever happened next, he would be ready to face it. The following day, Ethan arrived at City Hall with the recording device hidden securely in his briefcase. The weight of his decision bore down on him, a mixture of exhilaration and dread. He knew that exposing Voss and his network would send shockwaves through the city. It was a risky move, one that could shatter his career and put both him and his family in danger. But after everything that had happened, he had no choice. Rachel's humiliation, the threats against his family, the blatant abuse of power, it was all too much to ignore. He entered the mayor's office, where Lynn Carmichael was waiting, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Ethan had called her early that morning, telling her he had urgent information and needed to meet with her in private. Now, as he sat across from her, he felt a surge of gratitude that she had agreed to this meeting without asking too many questions. He knew Lynn wasn't one to back down, but he also understood the precarious position she was in. Supporting his crusade against Voss could cost her politically, and he respected her for being willing to listen. "Ethan," Lynn began, leaning forward, "you sounded urgent on the phone. What's going on?" He placed the recording device on her desk, his hand steady but his voice tense. "Lynn, I have something that could change everything. Last night, I managed to obtain evidence, solid, irrefutable evidence, of Deputy Chief Voss's corruption and abuse of power. This isn't just about what happened to Rachel. Voss is orchestrating a network within the department, targeting anyone who stands in his way. They're using intimidation, threats, even physical force to control people." Lynn's eyes widened as she reached for the device, her expression shifting from concern to shock. "You have evidence of this?" He nodded. "Everything is on that recording. I overheard Voss and his inner circle plotting to undermine me and anyone else who supports reform in the department. They're even willing to target civilians, including my family, to keep their grip on power. They consider themselves untouchable, and they're willing to break every rule to stay that way." She pressed play on the recording, and as Voss's voice filled the room, Ethan watched her expression harden. The sheer brazenness of Voss's words, the cold, calculated tone with which he discussed manipulating and destroying anyone in his way, left little room for doubt. By the time the recording ended, Lynn's hands were clenched, her eyes flashing with anger. "This is unbelievable," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "I knew there were issues within the department, but this is a coordinated attack against the very principles we're supposed to uphold." Ethan nodded. "And if we don't act, it'll only get worse. Voss and his network have turned the department into a personal empire. They're using public resources to intimidate, manipulate, and control. We need to dismantle this system from the inside. And it has to start now." Lynn was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the recording device. He could see the wheels turning in her mind, the conflict between her loyalty to the city and the knowledge of the political firestorm that would ensue if they went public with this. Finally, she looked up at him, her expression resolute. "Ethan, you know what this will mean. Going after Voss will trigger a backlash like we've never seen. He has allies not only in the department, but in local government and beyond. Once we release this information, there's no going back." "I understand," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "But if we let this continue, we're complicit. We can't just look the other way. The people of this city deserve to know the truth, and we owe it to them to fight for a police force they can trust." Lynn took a deep breath, her face steeling with resolve. "All right, we'll do this, but we need to be strategic. If we just release this recording without a plan, Voss and his allies will go into damage control. They'll manipulate the narrative, paint you as a rogue commissioner trying to settle personal grudges. We need a coalition, a group of trusted allies who will support us publicly, people who can't be easily intimidated." Ethan nodded, realizing the wisdom in her words. "I've been thinking the same thing. We need support from other city officials, community leaders, even members of the police department who still believe in justice." Lynn glanced at her calendar, then back at him. "Let me reach out to a few trusted colleagues, people who've stood up for accountability before. In the meantime, you should talk to Chief Inspector Harkness. If we're going to make this public, we need someone within the department to stand with us." Ethan left City Hall with a renewed sense of purpose. He had always known this wouldn't be easy, but with Lynn's support, he felt emboldened. She was right. They needed to be tactical, precise. Voss's network was powerful, but it wasn't infallible, and if they could expose it, they might just have a chance to rebuild the department from the ground up. Later that afternoon, he arranged a private meeting with Harkness. They met at an old diner on the outskirts of town, away from the prying eyes of anyone who might report back to Voss. Harkness arrived looking tense but determined, his face a mask of resolve as he took a seat across from Ethan. "Ethan, I heard about what you managed to capture last night. You really did it, didn't you?" Harkness's voice was low, his gaze intense. Ethan nodded. "I did. It's all on the recording, everything we suspected. And worse, Voss is planning to escalate if we don't back down. He has no boundaries, Daniel. And we need to stop him before he destroys more lives." Harkness looked around, as if checking for anyone who might overhear. "You're right. This has to end. But you know as well as I do that going public won't be enough. Voss has loyalists within the department, people who will cover for him, twist the story. If we're going to take him down, we need to dismantle his entire network, every piece of it." Ethan leaned in, his voice steady. "That's why I need you, Daniel. You know the department better than anyone. I need your help identifying everyone who's involved. Every officer, every contact, every thread Voss has pulled to keep his grip on power." Harkness took a deep breath, his expression hardening with determination. "You have my support, Ethan. I'll start compiling a list, but it won't be easy. These people are deeply entrenched. Voss has built this network over years, and he's careful. He knows who to trust and who to keep close. Then we'll take it one step at a time," Ethan replied, feeling a surge of gratitude for his friend's loyalty. "With your help, and with Lynn's support, we can expose them one by one." The next few days were a whirlwind of secret meetings, strategy sessions, and phone calls. Lynn worked tirelessly to secure support from trusted officials, calling in favors and rallying allies who were tired of the corruption festering within the department. Community leaders were briefed in confidence, and Ethan met with respected figures in the press, journalists with reputations for integrity and a history of exposing corruption. As their coalition grew, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. People were willing to stand with him, to fight for a city that valued justice over fear. But he also knew that Voss wouldn't go down without a fight. The closer they came to exposing him, the more dangerous he would become. The tension in the city was palpable, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Then, Just as they were finalizing their plan, the unexpected happened. One of Ethan's close allies in the department, a young officer named Jenna Morales, was attacked outside her home. She had been outspoken in her support of the commissioner's reforms, and her commitment to transparency had made her a target. She was found unconscious, with a warning scrawled in spray paint on her car. "Stay in line or pay the price." Ethan's heart sank when he heard the news. Jenna was in the hospital, recovering from her injuries. But the message was clear. Voss was willing to escalate, willing to harm anyone who stood in his way. The attack on Jenna sent a wave of fear through the department, and even some of Ethan's allies began to question whether it was worth the risk. Lynn called him that evening, her voice tight with anger and fear. "Ethan, this is getting out of hand. Voss is desperate, and he's willing to hurt anyone who threatens his control. We need to move now before he strikes again." Ethan felt a surge of resolve. "You're right. This ends now." The following day, they held a press conference. With Harkness at his side, Ethan took to the podium, flanked by community leaders, city officials, and allies within the police department. He held up the recording device, his voice steady as he addressed the assembled reporters. "This city deserves better than fear and intimidation," he began, his voice carrying through the crowd. "What we are about to share isn't just a story about corruption. It's a story about the abuse of power, about betrayal of the public trust. Deputy Chief Voss has used his position to control, to manipulate, to harm. And today we are here to expose the truth." He pressed play on the recording, and Voss's voice. The silence in the room was profound as Voss's voice played over the speakers. Every word echoed through the hall, filling the air with a tension so thick it seemed to press down on everyone present. The reporters listened, their expressions shifting from surprise to shock to anger as they absorbed the depth of Voss's arrogance, his calculated plans, and his willingness to abuse his power without remorse. Every sentence was a confession of the darkness that had spread through the department, of the deep-rooted corruption that had festered beneath the surface for too long. As the recording ended, Ethan glanced at Lynn, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. He took a steadying breath, knowing this moment would define not just his career, but the city's future. The room was silent, everyone waiting to hear what he would say next. "This," he began, his voice strong, "is not just the voice of a corrupt official. This is the voice of an organized effort to undermine justice, to intimidate and control. Deputy Chief Voss has betrayed the trust of this city. And it's not just him. He has allies, people who are complicit in this corruption, people who have allowed this abuse to continue unchecked." He looked directly into the cameras, his gaze steady and unwavering. "This is a turning point. We will not stand for this any longer. The people of this city deserve a police department that serves them, not one that manipulates them." The room erupted into questions as reporters clamored for details. They wanted to know about the other officers, the plans Voss had made, the scope of the corruption. Ethan held up his hands, calming the crowd as he continued. "There will be a full investigation, and every officer involved in this network will be held accountable," he said firmly. "I want to make it clear. This is not an attack on our police force as a whole. I believe in the good, hard-working officers who are committed to protecting this city. But those who use their badges to instill fear and consolidate power will be rooted out." Lynn stepped forward, her voice carrying a steely resolve. "Effective immediately, Deputy Chief Voss has been placed on administrative leave, pending the results of this investigation. We are taking steps to ensure the safety and protection of all officers and citizens who come forward to report any wrongdoing. We encourage those within the department who have information on these abuses to step forward, and we promise that their voices will be heard." As they finished, Ethan felt a wave of relief mingled with apprehension. This was the beginning of a grueling process, and he knew Voss wouldn't go down without a fight. But he also knew they had taken the first, most critical step. For the first time in a long time, the truth was out in the open, and there was no turning back. The fallout was immediate. News of the press conference spread quickly, sparking a wave of outrage throughout the city. The community rallied, demanding accountability, with protests and rallies forming outside the police department and city hall. People who had felt voiceless for years finally had a channel to express their frustration, and they weren't going to let this moment slip by. But as support grew, so did the threats. Ethan began receiving anonymous messages warning him to back down, subtle reminders that he was stepping into dangerous territory. He was followed. His phone line was tapped, and his office was bugged. It became clear that Voss's network was vast, reaching into places Ethan hadn't anticipated. One evening, he found an unmarked envelope on his doorstep. Inside was a single photo of Rachel, taken without her knowledge as she walked to her car. The implication was clear. His family was being watched, their safety hanging by a thread. Ethan's blood ran cold, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. He knew Voss's tactics. They were meant to intimidate, to drive him into submission. But he was more resolved than ever. Rachel stood by him, unwavering. She had known this journey would be dangerous, and the threats frightened her. But her faith in Ethan and in the fight for justice kept her grounded. Together, they worked on plans for heightened security and precautions, both for their home and for the allies who had stood with them. They knew that the more they uncovered, the more they would be targeted. Meanwhile, the investigation into Voss and his network gained momentum. Chief Inspector Harkness, who had joined the coalition with full force, worked tirelessly alongside a team of independent investigators. They combed through records, reviewed past cases, and interviewed officers willing to talk. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of the depth of Voss's control. A network of officers who had been loyal to him, benefiting from special assignments, favorable evaluations, and unofficial protections that allowed them to operate without consequence. As the evidence mounted, a second press conference was held to update the public. This time, the mood was even more charged. Reporters, activists, and citizens filled the room, their faces a mixture of anger and anticipation. Harkness took to the podium, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he recounted the findings. "We have confirmed that a group of officers within the department operated as part of an organized ring led by Deputy Chief Voss," Harkness stated. "They used their authority to intimidate, manipulate, and suppress anyone who threatened their power. This was not an isolated incident. It was a systematic abuse that has affected countless lives. The officers involved will face disciplinary actions, and several will be criminally charged." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a reflection of the city's pent-up frustration and desire for change. Ethan felt a swell of pride as he watched Harkness and Lynn take turns addressing the crowd, their words resonating with the community's hunger for accountability. But Voss wasn't done. From the safety of his lawyer's office, he held a press conference of his own, painting himself as the victim of a political witch hunt. He denied all accusations, claiming that the commissioner and the mayor were using him as a scapegoat for their own failures. He portrayed Ethan as an opportunist, someone willing to sacrifice the stability of the city for his own political gain. Ethan knew these tactics were coming, but it didn't make them any less frustrating. For days, the media buzzed with debates and arguments, with Voss's supporters insisting that the investigation was flawed, that it was a personal vendetta masquerading as justice. Ethan felt the weight of it, the endless battles, the constant scrutiny, but he refused to back down. Finally, after weeks of investigation and political maneuvering, the case went to court. Voss and his co-conspirators faced an extensive list of charges, from corruption and intimidation to abuse of power and obstruction of justice. The trial became the focal point of the city, with people packing the courthouse every day, eager to see justice served. Ethan took the stand, recounting the events in vivid detail, his voice unwavering as he described the abuse his wife had endured, the threats he'd received, and the recordings that had exposed Voss's crimes. He was cross-examined relentlessly, with Voss's lawyers attempting to paint him as a man with a personal vendetta, but Ethan remained calm, focused, and resolute. He knew that the city was watching, and he would not falter. The testimonies from other officers, some reluctantly, some boldly, added further weight to the case. Stories emerged of other citizens who had suffered under Voss's network, of families broken apart, lives destroyed, opportunities lost. By the time the trial ended, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than a day before delivering a guilty verdict on all charges. The city erupted in celebration. People gathered in the streets, cheering and embracing, finally feeling the weight of Voss's oppressive shadow lifting. The sense of relief was palpable, as though the entire city could breathe freely for the first time in years. Ethan and Rachel stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by friends, allies, and reporters. The questions were rapid fire, the excitement contagious, but amidst the chaos, Ethan felt a deep, quiet sense of peace. He had done it. He had taken a stand, fought against the darkness, and won. Later that evening, as they walked through the city, Ethan and Rachel felt the gratitude of the people around them. Strangers approached to shake their hands, to thank them, to tell them how much their courage had meant. The journey had been long, grueling, and at times terrifying, but they had made it through. As they returned home, Rachel looked up at him, a soft smile on her face. "You did it, Ethan. You changed everything." He took her hand, feeling a swell of gratitude and love. "We did it, Rachel. I couldn't have done any of this without you." As they stood together, Ethan knew that his fight wasn't over. There would be more battles to face, more challenges to overcome. But he also knew that he was no longer alone. The city had found its voice, its strength, and its resilience, and together they would forge a path forward. In the days that followed, reforms swept through the department. New policies were implemented, accountability measures tightened, and a renewed commitment to justice took root. The city had been scared, but it had emerged stronger, more united. And as Ethan continued his work, he knew that they had laid the foundation for a brighter, more just future. This was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a profound sense of hope. The city was healing, and he was proud to be a part of that transformation, knowing that they had fought for something bigger than themselves, something that would echo for generations to come.